Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on, Milo Wolf. So he is currently pursuing his Ph.D. on the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy and strength. And he has also been a coach for over 4 years at this time. And so we were just talking off air. I think it's April now. It was sometime early October, late September when we had you on last time, Milo. So welcome back on, man.
Thank you for having me. It was great last time, and I'm sure it'll be great today as well.
Yeah, really looking forward to talking about lengthened training. I know this is something that's been a hot topic, and we talked about it a good amount on our last podcast episode. But with it being like such a hot topic, I feel like things are just kind of coming out quick, probably misinformation, good information. So I wanted to just kind of almost do like a state of the union of lengthened training at this point. So before we dive into that though, is there any update on you in like the last 6 to 7 months in terms of like just it can be training, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've just been bulking very slowly for the past nearly a year now. I think I started in June of last year. So very gradually gaining weight. I've gained about maybe 15, 20 pounds in that time, 15 pounds thereabouts. It's been productive. I had switched to only lengthened partial training for a while. My goals were mostly hypertrophy, well, entirely hypertrophy for a while. And so based on the evidence, I made the switch from full range of motion for all my training to exclusively lengthened partial training. More recently, I've incorporated some powerlifting style training as well. The rest of my program is still purely lengthened partials, but I am incorporating some sets of 5 on the squat, bench, deadlift at the moment, with the exception of my upper body training, because I am taking part in one of my studies on range of motion, and so I can't do any benching for the time being. But once that's over, I'll be switching some of my training towards powerlifting style training as well. But otherwise, just been gaining weight, just been getting some muscle, and mostly been training with a partial range of motion in that lengthened position.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I wanted to touch on your training for 2 reasons, right? The lengthen, but then I have noticed on your social media lately you were doing a little bit more like sumo deadlifts, squats, like more powerlifting style. So I definitely want to hit on that before we dive into more of this training side of things. So you said you've been gaining for about I think a year now, a little less than a year. I think you said 15 pounds. So in that time, like, are you tracking your food intake? Like, what does that look like? Are you doing that? And is it a certain rate of gain per week? Or are you just kind of letting your body weight just come up a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm eating relatively intuitively. Like, I wouldn't say I'm tracking anything. I would say a couple of, like, 2 or 3 of my meals day to day are quite similar, right? Partly because I don't have time to cook at the moment during the day. Like with my PhD, with data collection, I'm finishing up my PhD. That's due to be submitted in May, so in a month from now, a month and a half. So it's been quite a rush to the finish line. And so 1 or 2 of my meals per day are literally just me grabbing a sandwich from the convenience store and eating that. I've been eating relatively intuitively with a few kind of rules in place. So I try and aim for at least 10 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and that keeps me reasonably satiated. And even if then beyond those 10 servings, I kind of eat whatever I want, it typically winds up with me gaining about 0.5% to 1% of body weight per month, which is what I'm aiming for. There's another few rules I have in place. Generally, I'll have at least 4 protein feedings a day, pretty much every day. Sometimes it might be 3, but it's 95% of the time it's 4 feedings a day, each one like 30 or 40 grams at least. So that's kind of what the evidence suggests is best anyways. I generally try and get some cholesterol on my diet because there's some evidence out there that dietary cholesterol can help with hypertrophy and strength gains. So I have a few things in place. Generally, try and have a meal reasonably soon after training. Try not to have a meal right before training, just because otherwise I go into training feeling bloated. That's not ideal for leg training, especially. And yeah, so I have certain rules in place, but otherwise it's been reasonably intuitive. I do make an effort to weigh myself consistently just to make sure that my diet is overall on point. But otherwise, as long as I meet those rules, I'm getting weight at the right pace. I think I'm honestly like, I couldn't tell someone that they're missing out on much, if anything, if they're hitting all those rules. So
Yeah, that sounds very similar to like what I have been doing in like my massing phase 2 is like I was tracking, pretty diligently for a little while, but this time around, I'm just like, I wanted to kind of take a break from that. And like you said, kind of follow those like more like eat intuitively, but have some rules in place to like to make sure you're like within this range. Right. And I found that that's been super helpful from like a mental health, headspace component. Right. And just cause it can just be, I feel like draining to have to track every little detail. And like you said, it's like with those in place, it's like you're probably hitting most of the things there with it in terms of building muscle, right? And then obviously the rest is going to come from, hey, making sure you're pushing your training and making sure that's in a good spot. So I love that. And I can totally relate to that. So as far as like, let's say, you know, again, with you being a little bit more intuitive with it, let's say like, again, you're trying to gain that like half percent per month in terms of your body weight. If you do see that slow down a little bit, do you just try to just eat a little bit more, like more calorie dense foods, or what does that usually look like?
Yep, pretty much. If I don't gain weight at the right pace, whether that's too fast or too slow, I essentially just adjust one of my meals typically a bit upwards. Like maybe if my breakfast and lunch are pretty consistent day to day and I don't really have time to change it up a lot, I might just have a few more calories for dinner and see how my weight changes. Generally, though, even if my weight doesn't really increase the right pace for a couple of weeks, with bulking, gaining weight, massing, whatever you want to call it, I don't think things happen on that small of a scale anyways.
Right.
So I don't freak out if for 2 weeks, for example, I'm maintaining, as long as my overall like monthly rate of weight gain is still on point. I'm not too worried. And certainly when you zoom out, so I kind of have a chart that I established with sort of like the more conservative rate of weight gain, which is about 0.5% a month, and the more aggressive one. And as long as I stay between those lines in the longer term over like 6 or 12 months, I'm pretty happy. And it's kind of how I've been doing things. And I couldn't tell you for sure that you'd see meaningfully better results by being more strict. And at the same time, because one of my hobbies nowadays is cooking, so when I get time, I like to cook. It does remove one of those barriers of, oh, let me track everything, which can be a bit more of a barrier when you don't have enough time to cook anyways, to then also consider, let me track everything precisely. So I think especially when your goal isn't an extreme, like if you're in contest prep, for example, you may definitely need to be more precise with tracking, more consistent. But if your goal is relatively achievable and quite flexible, then I'm not sure that level of meticulousness is necessary.
Right. Yeah. Like you said, it's, you know, maybe in a fat loss phase or something like that, you might want to track a little bit more because, you know, in today's world, it's a little bit tougher to be in a deficit consistently and really stick with that. Right. Whereas like surplus, pretty easy to do and whatnot. And I agree with you too. I find that like in building phases, again, whatever you want to call them, whenever you're trying to gain weight, build muscle, like I do find that it does seem like I feel like weight fluctuates a little bit more. Like you can kind of have these weird fluctuations. And so like, zooming out, I find has always been super helpful there. Cause like you said, in the short term, it's not like that's not like not as much is going to happen in that short term. So zooming out there, I think is super important. You did mention pre-workout meal. You said you don't really like to eat before. What's kind of your cutoff there? Because I know, you know, the research kind of says, you know, for like performance, you know, getting some sort of carbohydrate in, you know, a couple hours before is going to be beneficial. So what does that look like for you there?
Yeah, so I think similarly to a lot of the protein feeding research, where you do have to consider that it's not the most ecologically valid environment. Like most people don't just have protein powder for a meal, right? So when you try and apply the findings of, for example, a study comparing 8 10-gram feedings to 4 20-gram feedings to 2 40-gram feedings to see what the best protein feeding frequency per day is, when you try and apply those sorts of findings to your own eating schedule, you have to consider, well, things might look a bit different for you because you're actually having vegetables, fruits, fiber, fat, that also digestion, and that sort of stuff. Likewise, with the pre-workout meal, I think that provided you had some carbs in the last couple of hours, you're probably covered to an extent. I think the main things for pre-workout nutrition are, one, not to go into a session feeling bloated or like so bloated that it impacts performance during the session or enjoyment even. Especially with leg training, if you had a big meal rep beforehand, sometimes later into the session or with high rep work or with any sort of bent over work, oftentimes that can be an issue, especially while bulking. So that's kind of, during bulking, that's a big consideration. During cutting, oftentimes your meals are small enough anyways that it doesn't really matter. The second consideration, besides not being bloated or nauseated going into a session, would be hunger. So if you're going into a session really hungry to the point that it's distracting you from training hard and from enjoying the session, that's also an issue. And so just by those two considerations, you kind of arrive at a point where you say, okay, well, I don't want to have a meal probably within the last hour before training, unless it's a very small meal or a very small amount of food. But I also don't want to eat like my last meal before training 6 hours before, because then you might go hungry during the session. Generally, what I do is I have some sort of relatively low volume protein source. So what I do is have a fat-free yogurt before training, like an hour to 2 hours before, along with some sort of fruit, right? That can be an apple, can be some dried fruit, a banana, what have you. And that covers me pretty well. It doesn't make me super bloated. It does keep me reasonably satiated, at least satiated enough until the meal after training. And I think that's a pretty good option. I would generally not have a huge meal before training because that can result in nausea. And also wouldn't have too small of a meal because then you may be missing out on the carbohydrate effects. I will say the carbohydrate research before training is less compelling than I used to think, right? Like the carbohydrate mouth rinsing stuff, it seems to be potentially somewhat hunger mediated. So as long as you have some food in you and you're not hungry, that's most of the performance effect. There might be an independent effect of carbohydrates. I'm not super well versed in that literature, but I think it probably doesn't hurt as long as, again, you're not nauseated or going hungry.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of like, you have to take the person into account. Like some people, again, they don't like having that feeling of like being full or anything like that before training. So you need to take that into consideration. And then obviously on the other end of the spectrum, you don't, like you said, you don't want to go super long without it. My understanding of it too is that, again, so long as you're not going like super long without carbohydrates before, and you're at least getting a little bit in and you're not like super hungry, you're in a good spot there. Because I think at that point, I would imagine then like your overall carbohydrate intake from like days prior and whatnot are probably going to be the most important there with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that there is probably a distinction to be made between the effect of overall glucose and glycogen presence, right? Over the past few days, that's mostly impacted by how you've been eating over the past few days, right? Like whether you have glycogen present in your muscles, to what extent, etc. There is maybe an independent effect, so a distinction to be made between that and the effect of having carbohydrate ingestion right before, just in terms of the effects of carbohydrate mouth rinsing, for example. I'm not sure how big those effects are, and those are kind of distinct. If there is an effect there, it may make sense to have some carbohydrates beforehand, but if there isn't an effect there, then all you really need to worry about is being reasonably satiated, not being nauseated, and having had reasonable nutrition over the past couple of days so that you don't go into a session with not enough muscle glycogen, essentially.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes, people can get caught up in like the micro when it's like, the macro is going to be the big thing there with it. Cool, man. So as far as your training goes, I'm curious to hear about, first, I think let's start with the lengthened partials. I know that was something that you decided to do. I'm not sure how long you did that for. It sounds like you're still doing it. But let's kind of start there and just kind of talk about, the rationale behind it and whatnot. And maybe just like a brief overview of it as well, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think last time I was on this podcast, I discussed the meta-analysis we conducted. Since then, there have been a couple more studies comparing a full range of motion to lengthened partials for hypertrophy. There was one study in the calves by Cassiano and colleagues where they compared full range of motion calf raises. All of this was done on leg press, and people were assigned to different groups. One group did full range of motion, or about 50 degrees of ankle plantar flexion. One group did lengthened partials, so about half the full range of motion, but in a lengthened position, so from the fully stretched position to halfway up. And the third group did shortened partials from the midpoint until the fully contracted position. They measured hypertrophy at two sites, one more lateral site, one more to the outside of the body, and one more medial site. They had people perform calf raises for, I want to say, 8 weeks or so, twice a week on a leg press machine, and they measured hypertrophy before and after. On one of the sites, the full range of motion group and the lengthened partials group saw more hypertrophy than the shortened partials group. Whereas for the other side, the lengthened partials group saw better hypertrophy than both the full range of motion group and the shortened partials group. So on the whole, this study basically suggests that lengthened partials may be better than full range of motion, at least for some sites. And full range of motion is likely better than shortened partials for hypertrophy. And both lengthened partials and full range of motion is better for hypertrophy than shortened partials. And now when you kind of zoom out, there are now 4 studies comparing lengthened partials, so doing a partial range of motion in the stretch position to a full range of motion. And out of those 4 studies, 3 studies have found a benefit for hypertrophy from lengthened partials over full range of motion, and 1 study found no difference. So there's been 2 studies in the quads, 1 study by Pedrosa and colleagues using a leg extension, 1 study by Workhausen and colleagues in 2021 using the leg press. Interestingly, that's the only study that found no difference in hypertrophy between full range of motion and lengthened partials. That study was a bit unique in that they used sort of explosive style training, and the lengthened partials group was doing 9 degrees of range of motion, which is essentially like, that's very little, right? Compared to about, I think, 79 degrees for the full range of motion group. So quite a stark difference there. So quite a unique study design, and interestingly enough, also the only study that didn't find a difference. Also a different approach to statistical analysis. So if you read the results section of that paper, it might be a bit difficult to interpret for a lot of people. But essentially, I'd say there wasn't a meaningful difference in hypertrophy between the 2 approaches. So 2 studies on the quads, I would say the quote unquote more applicable one using the leg extension, found better hypertrophy following lengthened partials, specifically mostly in the distal portions of the quads, which is lining up with the research that we have overall that says that lengthened training might be better at promoting distal hypertrophy than regular training. But whereas for proximal sites, like closer to the hip for the quads, doesn't really seem to be a difference or that big of a difference. So 2 studies on the quads, one showing a benefit of lengthened partials, one showing no difference. One study in the triceps, and this was the Goto study in 2018, I think, where they had people perform skull crushers. One group did full range of motion, so from full elbow extension to full elbow flexion and back up, whereas the other group did partials in the more lengthened range, and they saw better hypertrophy when doing partials in lengthened range. And then the final study, as I mentioned earlier, was done in the calves by Cassiano and colleagues, and again, greater hypertrophy for the lengthened partials group overall, or at least overall the hypertrophy results did favor the lengthened partials group first, then for range of motion, then shortened partials. So overall, we now have data in 3 muscle groups with regards to lengthened partials versus for range of motion, and it seems pretty consistent. So I'm inclined to think that it's a generalizable principle for most, if not all, muscle groups at this point. And I'm not just saying that because we have 4 studies comparing lengthened partials to for range of motion. I'm saying that because the same findings are found in a variety of other domains, essentially. So there's now quite a mounting body of evidence comparing partials at different muscle lengths. So for example, I'm sure you saw the recent study by Pedrosa and colleagues again, using the preacher curl, where they had 2 groups, one group performing shortened partials preacher curls, so kind of the top portion, and one group performing lengthened partials preacher curls, kind of the bottom portion. And again, hypertrophy favored the lengthened partials group. So very, very consistently, even when comparing for range of motion to lengthened partials, which most people are kind of like more skeptical of, it does seem like lengthened work is beneficial for hypertrophy, especially for distal hypertrophy. And I think that principle has been well documented across a variety of muscle groups. And so that's why back in January or so, I decided, let me make the switch to only lengthened partials training. I think at that point, the evidence had become pretty convincing. At the very least, that you wouldn't miss out on anything by doing a lengthened partials only if your primary or only goal was hypertrophy. And so I was like, well, let me put my money where my mouth is and actually apply these studies how they were conducted, right? Because back in the day, I was more a fan of applying this research in terms of making slight modifications or tweaks to your exercise selection, to your tempo, to your how you perform your sets, rather than actually doing lengthened partials. And that's kind of, I think, a mistake in applying this literature, in the sense that if we have literature directly comparing for range of motion to lengthened partials, and lengthened partials do better, the most direct and foolproof way of applying those findings is by actually doing lengthened partials. We don't have direct evidence on what pausing in a lengthened position does, or what selecting a lengthened emphasis exercise does. But we do have evidence directly comparing for range of motion to lengthened partials. And so I think the most foolproof and the most direct and the most surefire way to apply that literature is to actually do lengthened partials. And so that's what I decided to do. I think beforehand, and nowadays even, a lot of people were flirting with the idea of lengthened work being good, but they weren't aware of the literature enough or didn't think about it in the right terms, I think. And so they kind of just flirted with the idea and applied it in some ways that aren't necessarily evidence-based in a way. Because while it stands to reason that pausing in a stretch position would be better for hypertrophy because training in length positions better, we just don't have any direct evidence. And so it's kind of an indirect way of applying the evidence that doesn't necessarily have a lot of backing. And I think the most direct way would be to actually do lengthened partials. So that's what I did. And so since about January, I've been doing lengthened partials only, with the exception of, for the past like 2 weeks, doing some 5s on sumo deadlifts, conventional deadlifts, squats, etc. And yeah, I think I couldn't really oversell my experience here because it's an N=1 with confounders like my stress levels changing, a variety of things changing over time. It's not really worth anything. I think it's worth certain things in terms of understanding how you might want to apply that concept to your own training, like where it works, how you might need to apply it to make it work. But yeah, so it's been an interesting process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really cool. I definitely want to dive into the research on that a little bit more. And so I guess for you then, like switching over to this, what were some like kind of changes that you noticed in terms of like, or did you notice any changes in terms of like how you maybe had a program or anything like that?
So going into it, I kind of expected my volume would drop and it didn't really. I initially did get a bit more sore from that training compared to full range of motion training, but that very quickly faded away. I think it was mostly just novelty, essentially. Um, I'm gonna say that I think my back has grown more than in a long time. I'm really not ready to say that it's because of lengthened partials. It's just kind of like maybe I'm training it harder now, what have you. Like there's so many confounders that I'm not willing to make a strong claim now. But I do think that I've seen some decent growth over the past 4 months, at least by sort of what you would expect, the standards you'd expect at this stage of my training career, having trained for this long, compared to like a comparable 4 month period before. Um, so I don't think I've seen worse hypertrophy than before. I think I've seen the same or maybe slightly better, but it's difficult to detect with the tools we have at hand for just me looking at myself, right? Um, I'll say initially there was a bit more soreness. At the very start, I was finding it difficult on certain exercises to get as good of a pump. I'm not sure how much that means, right? Like a pump isn't exactly the most validated predictor of hypertrophy long term, right? Like just because you get a pump or not. There is some evidence to suggest it might play a role, but I wouldn't use it as a strong predictor of anything. Yeah, I think my volume requirements were pretty much the same. I would say initially, and I think this is a fear that some people have as well, there was a bit of a fear in my head, like, oh, I'm using heavier weights here, or I'm not able to brace in a neutral position, quote unquote, whether that would cause more injuries. But I think that's mostly like a belief thing rather than anything that's super evidence based. Like we don't have any evidence to suggest that it would be more injurious. So not a huge difference, to be honest. I think the people I've spoken to about it in person have often said, oh, I probably wouldn't enjoy training like that. And I think that's kind of one reason why some people at least might not want to do it, especially for example, RDLs or squats. Like it does take some getting used to. I actually don't think it's that bad. I almost quite like it. It makes me feel like I'm training the most productive part of the movement more effectively, as opposed to kind of spending half of my RDL set at the top, kind of just breathing, I guess. But yeah, those have been kind of my takeaways so far.
So I guess just to explain to the audience who maybe isn't like familiar, like what, so for example, doing a lengthened partial, like like let's say you're doing a squat, right? Like I think I saw you do like Smith machine squats. What like how would that be different than a full range? Like what was kind of the area that you were focused on specifically? Obviously the lengthened position, but
yes. Yeah, absolutely. So the lengthened position, the most direct way of thinking about partial repetitions in the lengthened position is probably to base your range of motion on the range of motion being used in the research, because ultimately that's what we have findings on. Generally in the research, something like half the full range of motion is used. So I think as long as you're between 1/3, 2/3 of the full range of motion when doing lengthened partials, you're kind of in the clear. We don't have any strong evidence suggesting that, for example, doing 1/3 of the full range of motion is better than doing 2/3, or 2/3 is better than 1/3. And so I think as long as you're in the right ballpark, you're fine for now. So using 1/3, 2/3 of the full range of motion or so in the first half of the movement. So in the first half of the lifting portion. So for the squat, for example, the part where you're lifting the weight is from when you're in the hole to lockout at the top. And so in the first half or so of that movement is a lengthened partial. Same thing for a pull down. The first half of the lifting portion, when the weight stack actually goes up, that's a lengthened partial. So that's how I'd apply it. So just to give some examples, for the squat, from the hole up to halfway up, maybe just at the hole. For the RDL, from the bottom position when the weight is essentially touching the floor to about halfway up or just above the knee level. For pull downs, from a full stretch at the very top to about halfway down. For a bench, that might be from the chest to about halfway up or halfway to lockout. One concern that's been expressed by people that I haven't found to be too much of an issue is standardization. So I think beforehand that was a bit more of a concern for me as well, but having thought about it and having actually experimented with it, it's not much of a concern. So theoretically, when you're doing a full range of motion, you kind of know what range of motion you're using, right? Like you're going as deep as you can and then getting as much of a contraction as you can. That should be a pretty stable construct or concept over time. Like you don't get much more flexible session to session, so it's a very easily standardizable thing. With a partial range of motion, you could argue that unless you have certain stops in place or certain things in place, it can be quite difficult to standardize session to session. So performance can sort of fluctuate over time, and it can be difficult to tell whether you got stronger or not, or whether you change range of motion and so forth. In practice, for most compound exercises, there's certain references or like points of reference, landmarks, or references as far as your bodily positioning go that you can use. So for example, for dumbbell pressing, what I typically do is I press the dumbbells up until my elbows reach an angle of about 90 degrees or right angle, and then come back down. For squatting, it might be until I feel like I'm just out the hole or just above parallel. For dumbbell rows, for example, or for any sort of rowing, typically to just about past the knees is pretty good. Likewise for RDLs, deadlifting the bar up to just about knee level and then coming back down is pretty good. So for most exercises, especially machine exercises, there's also a landmark of the machine or a feature of the machine that you can pull onto. And then when you reach that point, you can just control the eccentric back down. So oftentimes there are points of reference that you can use to pretty easily standardize. I would say for at least half to 2/3 of exercises, there's a very clear point that you can use. The second point I wanted to make regarding standardization is that I'm not sure how big of a role that plays in terms of training stimulus. Ultimately, I think standardization of range of motion comes down mostly to what I call training hygiene, where it is important to kind of be able to assess progress and performance over the long term. But it's not hugely important in terms of actually imparting a stimulus upon the target muscles. If we acknowledge that range of motion itself has a relatively small impact on hypertrophy, then by definition, standardization or small fluctuations in range of motion week to week will have a next to non-existent impact on adaptations or stimulus, right? Provided you're in the right ballpark, plus or minus, say, 5-10%, you're likely not seeing a meaningful or even existing difference in stimulus imparted. So I think that it's something that people get drawn to, especially if they're from a certain crowd in the evidence-based space where like they really want to standardize everything. And I've been there, so I'm not going to even blame them for it. But I think when you think about range of motion conceptually and you see the effect sizes we're talking about, it's just not a meaningful difference. And I think it's more of a theoretical concern than it is a practical issue, let's say, because in practice, a lot of the time, you do have points of reference to use for standardization's sake.
So like basically what you're saying there is like that the standardization, which I could see, right? Because it's like, because you're not doing that full range of motion there, it could get confusing in terms of, hey, what is that range of motion that you're going to stay consistent with? But from what I'm understanding from you is that the difference in your potential range of motion there is not going to be that drastic to where it should alter like your performance or anything like that, essentially.
Absolutely. And even if it does slightly alter your performance, people sometimes overestimate the impact of, say, lifting 200 pounds or 205 pounds for a session on the actual stimulus.
Yeah.
You know, like we now have evidence that the proximity to failure, for example, isn't hugely important for hypertrophy as long as you're in a reasonable range of like maybe, I don't know, between failure and like 5 to 8 reps in reserve. So whether you're lifting 200 pounds for 10 on bench this week or 205, and whether it's with a slightly larger range of motion or slightly less large range of motion, I'm talking about small differences in range of motion here. Obviously, I'm the range of motion guy, so I'm going to be advocating for you to do lengthened partials. But if we're talking about slight differences in range of motion week to week, these really aren't going to play a major or even any role in how much of a stimulus for hypertrophy you get from that session.
Again, it's going to be more so in like you just said earlier, it's going to be more in the long term in terms of like, as long as you're progressing long term, that's going to be more important than like the like very short term there with it, basically.
Absolutely. And ultimately, like if your sessions are stimulative, you'll progress whether you're tracking things accurately or not. You could be tracking progress in no way at all. Provided your sessions are actually stimulating hypertrophy, you'll grow, you know? And so as long as each session is productive for hypertrophy, yes, it can be a nice diagnostic tool to assess performance over time alongside other tools, but it's not the only one. And because there's measurement error, like for example, let's say when you had your, let's say you measure performance at 0 months and at 6 months, if you had a good day at 0 months and a bad day at 6 months, you might conclude that you've grown no muscle, right? That's why you use several tools at once because each tool has some measurement error. And I think the measurement error that's introduced by using a partial range of motion really isn't large enough to cause an issue here, especially when you're using performance as one of several tools to assess performance or progress over time.
And I've been there too, right? Where it's like you kind of chase that logbook, and you could almost argue that could be something that gets you in a little bit more trouble because then it's like technique could alter drastically if you're just chasing that. So definitely something to be careful with. And I think it's like I said, I've run into that just like you have as well too. So what were you mentioned that you had some muscle groups that were a little bit tougher to get a pump in. What were some of those, and maybe what were some like muscle groups that were just like a little bit tougher maybe to train this way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say the ones that were more difficult to get a pump with were the muscle groups that, ironically enough, don't usually get trained super well in the lengthened range. So biceps, for example, were one where for cable curls, even now I'm performing them as part of the upper body study I'm running on range of motion. But For biceps, for like side delts to an extent, for back, for those sorts of muscle groups where the bottom position or the stretch position usually isn't too difficult, it was quite an odd experience, I guess. Maybe it took some getting used to, mostly to feel the target muscle and get a pump in the target muscle in a position that I wasn't used to training in hard. But for the biceps, for example, it was just a bit awkward for the first few weeks where I didn't really feel like I was getting a pump that much. After a few weeks, to be honest, it's gotten a lot better. And I think it is somewhat exercise dependent, where certain exercises may just lend themselves slightly better to getting a pump, especially with lengthened partials. So I found, for example, that following on from the Pedrosa study I mentioned earlier, doing lengthened partials on preacher curl, it's great. Like you get a nasty pump, a nasty muscle connection. We also have some evidence comparing preacher curls to incline curls now, by the way, where preacher curls seem to cause a bit more growth because they essentially place more tension on the elbow flexors in a reasonably lengthened position, as opposed to the incline curl. Yes, they lengthen the biceps long head more, but they don't place much tension in that lengthened position. So, for example, preacher curls instantly like felt great. So essentially exercises where the lengthened position was already challenging, reasonably challenging, lengthened partials felt very intuitive. But I think for exercises that previously have like a very sort of shortened bias resistance curve, getting used to doing lengthened partials and getting a pump during that exercise was a bit challenging. I would say for most people, the exercises where it's the most daunting and challenging to introduce lengthened partials are going to be compound lower body exercises. I would say RDLs and squats primarily, and hack squats as well. Funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago, I had some random guy at the gym. It reminded me, do you remember that video of someone deadlifting in like Canada in a commercial gym? And someone just comes over to him and like kicks the bar out of his hands while he's deadlifting?
I don't
This
think
was from like
so.
a few years ago. It was a few years ago. It was basically just from like a commercial gym. Someone was deadlifting. He was kind of making some noise, and someone just comes over and kicks the bar out of his hands and like starts shouting at him. It kind of reminded me of that because I was doing hack squats, lengthened partials, and I think so. So I was doing my set. He came over and re-racked the weight on me, like without me even noticing because he was behind me, and I just sort of turned around and was like, "What?" And my headphones were in, so I didn't really catch what he was saying. But it was a situation where I don't think he was doing it for my safety. I think he was like, he had a bit of an ego about it, and I was like, okay, and I just carried on doing my set. But yeah, I think for most people, doing lengthened partials on squats, RDLs, or lower body compound work is going to be quite daunting. I think most people have some, how should I put it? A lot of people have some safety concerns about their lower back, their knees, etc. And so, especially with the lower back, if they feel like they can't get a good breath at the top of each rep and brace before they descend into the hole, that can be a bit daunting. It was a bit daunting for the first couple of weeks, but I think once you have a new breathing pattern down, like for me, for example, that means that when I reach the top position of each lengthened partial, that's when I breathe out, breathe in, brace, and repeat. Initially, it took a bit of experimenting to see what felt most comfortable, and that's kind of what I settled with. So yeah, I'd say for most people, lower body compound exercises are going to be where it's most difficult and most daunting. And for me, any sort of bicep work initially, especially, was the most challenging to get a pump with.
And I think the lower body aspect, I feel like that's probably the case anyways, even if you're doing full range of motion training, right? It just sucks. But yeah, no, that's interesting with that guy. I wonder if, like you said you didn't think he did it for your safety. I could see where maybe if he saw you like not doing a full range, maybe he felt like you were just like doing too much weight or something, or like you were, I don't know, who knows? That's interesting. But either way, that's why like when people are training now, it's just like, I'm gonna let them do their thing because you never really know like what they're doing
Exactly.
and the reason for it,
Exactly. It's just funny because so I'm gonna, you know what? I'm gonna profile him here and say that he did seem like the sort of person to be a bit of a meathead, right? And it's just funny because I never really speak to anyone or correct anyone's form in the gym at all unless they literally ask me for it. And it's just funny because like this is literally the topic of my PhD. Like without wanting to flex it, I'm probably one of the most qualified people in the world to speak about this topic specifically, right? And so for him to come up to me like, yeah, that's not safe or whatever, it's like, man, this is like reverse karma, like I'm trying my best here to be, my own business and stuff like that. And then that sort of stuff happens. I'm like, wow, that's incredible.
But as you know, like same thing, they don't know what you're doing. Like you just don't know their intent or whatever. So it's just like, whatever, it's just miscommunication and it's just not worth, like getting
100%.
diving too much into it. So
100%, man, 100%.
cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense with the biceps. And that was actually one of the things, maybe we'll have time here in a little bit, was talking about like, I think that I think the data-driven strength guys were the ones that kind of made me think about this, was like where the toughest part of the lift is going to have an effect too, right? So like they made that example there of the preacher curl versus the incline curl. And I was like, that makes a lot of sense, right? So it's like not necessarily just like getting it in the lengthened position, but also like, if it's a little bit more challenging in that lengthened position, that might be make it a little bit, tougher or better for hypertrophy. So and maybe we can hit on that in a little bit, but just a few more things on like your training experiment here. Was there anything else maybe that you found out that you didn't think of beforehand?
Yeah, one thing that surprised me a little bit practically was that certain exercises were easier than others. So switching from full range of motion RDLs, for example, to lengthened partial RDLs, I actually had to drop my working weight slightly because I was essentially working in quote unquote the hardest part of the lift. Interestingly, for example, squats and RDLs, the top part of the lift is kind of a break. And so for very low repetition sets, lengthened partials are kind of comparable to full range of motion sets, because you get like, 2 or 3 seconds break with, say, a set of 5 anyways, with full range of motion. But then at the higher the repetition range, if you're constantly working in that lengthened position, if that lengthened position is reasonably challenging, you don't get any break. And so you can actually see that your working weight goes down a little bit compared to doing full range of motion, right? Kind of like if you think about doing leg extensions, but doing only the top bit, right? The hardest bit. If you were doing like 30 reps of that versus 30 reps with full range of motion, you may actually find that you use substantially less weight with the just top bit because you don't really get a break at the bottom. So for certain exercises, I had to drop the load. I kind of expected to be able to use more load on everything, especially like back work, side delt work, bicep work, etc., where typically the length and range is the easiest. But some exercises like skull crushers, bench to an extent, squats and RDLs to an extent required a bit less weight. Some exercises were about the same, like maybe, I don't know, wrist curls or some compound upper body work as well, like overhead pressing. But then some exercises definitely, like back work, vertical pulling, horizontal pulling, side delt work, rear delt work, and bicep work. For those exercises, generally, you could use more weight. So it's kind of interesting to kind of figure out, okay, well, how much weight can I use for each of these exercises, body parts, what have you. I think that was one, not a surprise, but I didn't expect to see it, especially when in most of the studies on range of motion, when they do report the working load being used, typically the partial range of motion group does use more. But I guess that's down to what exercises specifically were being looked at, because different exercises have different resistance curves, and different body parts that haven't maybe been studied directly also have different strength curves. So there is that consideration.
So like, for example, they're like with your back work, like the lengthened part is, again, obviously where your arms are stretched out, and the toughest part of the lift, from my understanding, is going to be that top part, right? But that's the shortened position. So it's like you're able to get away with doing a little bit more weight and those specific ones because, and right, is that kind of the understanding there with that?
Absolutely, yeah. So for example, now I'm running a study comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion in the upper body, right? And so I'm taking part in the study myself as well. So I've been assigned, randomized to the lengthened partials group, and it's 3 days a week of upper body training, measuring hypertrophy before and after, 8 weeks in duration, in trained lifters who've been training for at least 3 years. A pretty robust hypertrophy program, like 10 to 15 sets per week to failure. So like pretty hard training. And as part of that program, one day has underhand pull downs for 6 reps. And for that, for example, I'm literally using the full stack plus additional weight, like for half reps in the lengthened position. Whereas with full range of motion, I was using just shy of the full stack for 6 reps. So there is like a notable, maybe like maybe like a 10-15% difference in the load you're able to use. So you're able to use about 10 or 15% more weight, in my experience, for lengthened partials for pull downs compared to full range of motion. So there is a difference on certain exercises. Rarely is it a huge difference. If it is a huge difference, I would say check yourself a little bit. I think one consideration is that when you tell people to do lengthened partials or partials of any kind, one of two things or two of two things can happen. Either they start speeding up the tempo, where like they don't control the eccentric at all anymore, and then each rep takes like half a second. And then, yeah, that makes the lift easier, obviously, because you're not controlling the eccentric anymore. Or the second thing is they kind of throw form away as well. They're like, oh, I'm doing partials, so let me just lift the weight however I can. It's like, no, you're doing partials, but you're still trying to make the target muscle groups work instead of your glutes, hamstrings, lower back, whatever you want to, typically. So I think that can result in more load being used, but if you're controlling it reasonably well, and you likely should, because let's say, for example, the minimum number of reps per set to make a set stimulative is 5 or so, just to get enough time or retention or volume load per set to make a set pretty effective. If you start just swinging the weight and being very quick with your tempo as well, you may need to do like 8 or 10 reps or more per set to actually get that same effect, at least. So I'd say control the tempo still. But generally, I'd be surprised if you control the tempo and use proper form, if you see a bigger than like 10 or 20% difference in weight being used, plus or minus, right? Minus maybe for skull crushers or RDLs or what have you, and plus maybe for like back work. So.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, it's, you don't, I guess with the rep range is like, you didn't necessarily change that around. It was just, you kind of altered the weight to make sure that you still stayed within a certain rep range. And again, just to make sure that was a stimulative set there, basically. So cool. Any other insights or anything that you want to share from this or anything like that before we kind of talk about, we'll still talk about length and work, but just kind of move on just a little bit from this particular one.
Yeah. So I think that when you actually do this sort of thing, and I know other people have done the same thing, like Brian Borstein, I know, has been doing some stuff. I know Dave McConey stopped training one arm. Was he the one who stopped training one arm entirely? I think he was, right?
Brian Borstein is doing the one arm.
One arm. Okay, gotcha. That's Brian Borstein. The one calf was Dave McConey though, right?
That may have been him. I'm not sure.
I think it's Dave McConey. Yeah. I think it is. So when you do that sort of thing, you realize that obviously I didn't make as an extreme of a change. I just went from full range of motion to lengthened partials. Like I'm still training my actual muscle groups. But I think you realize that relatively few things in lifting have that huge of an impact.
Right.
And that you can make a lot of things work, which is kind of validated by the fact that, a lot of really good bodybuilders, a lot of really good powerlifters, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, do things quite differently and still seemingly wind up at a similar place as far as muscularity or competitiveness go. So I think that sometimes the impact of these things can be overstated. And, I probably shouldn't be saying this if I'm trying to sell lengthened partials, but lengthened partials at this point in time, honestly, unless you have some sort of injury constraint that feels worse while training lengthened position, unless you can't make it work logistically as far as the weight you have available, like for example, for pull downs nowadays, it's getting a bit challenging. Because I don't have enough weight available, or you have a preference, like you prefer training with full range of motion. At this point, if your primary or only goal is hypertrophy, a very, very strong case can be made for lengthened partial only training. But yeah, it's interesting to see that a variety of approaches will still end most people up in a similar place because most variables within lifting just don't have that huge of an impact.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that's important to make. So I guess, could this be something too, where like somebody could like maybe go out, like, just like, sometimes we like to have phasic approaches to things. Could it be something where you do have kind of a phasic approach to it, where you do spend some time maybe just focused on length and partials, and then you go back to full range? Is that something that maybe you're going to consider as well too? Or do you think you'll pretty much stick with length and partials for foreseeable future?
Yeah. So because it doesn't have that big of an impact, like range of motion itself, I think you could absolutely adopt a phasic approach if you do full range of motion for a while, kind of get sick of it or bored of it, and you prefer to switch it up, by all means. I think that's a fine approach. I think if I was trying to get someone to maximize hypertrophy at this point, I would probably get them to do lengthened partials exclusively. But I think it's a fine approach. And again, we're not talking about a huge difference here. For myself, I think unless my goals change, as they have relatively recently, where I've said, oh, let me incorporate some minimum dose powerlifting style training, essentially. So I'm doing some competition squatting, competition deadlifting, competition benching a few times a week, just sets of 5. So they're at least reasonably hypertrophy inducing still. And otherwise, the rest of my programming has stayed essentially the same, minus changing the amount of deadlifting and squatting work I was doing, because I'm also incorporating squatting and lifting directly. But otherwise, like, I'm not doing any direct accessory work. Everything else is still lengthened partials only, like sissy squats, leg curls, all that sort of stuff. And so I think in my own training, I would only really deviate from lengthened partial only training at this point if other evidence came out saying that, hey, actually, full range of motion is better, or another range of motion is better, or if my goals changed as they have recently. But I think that lengthened partials at this point in time, I can recommend for hypertrophy.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. So I guess then to kind of go off of this, again, you like we said earlier, you had that paper that came out recently, but I mean, I know that you guys had it written up, I think, and everything in like September, October. Um, and so I think some of the things, like there were some things maybe that like I heard today and like maybe that we talked about last time that may have changed a little bit on your end. So I'm just kind of curious to hear if there is anything like that in terms of like the research that's come out that's been like, hey, this is kind of what the meta-analysis found, but I'm already kind of like changing my mind on that a little bit.
Yeah, so definitely nowadays there's more, I can state with more confidence that lengthened partials are likely better for hypertrophy than for range of motion. Um, Equally, I can also say, having read the literature a bit more closely and having had more literature come out, that there does seem to be a regional effect on hypertrophy of the muscle length you train at, where longer muscle length training generally seems to induce similar proximal hypertrophy as shorter muscle length training, but greater distal hypertrophy. So proximal refers to closer to the origin point of a muscle, which is kind of the point where a muscle originates, that is closer to the center of your body, and the insertion point is closer to, well, further away from it. So there's 2 points where a muscle attaches, the origin point and the insertion point. More proximal points refer to closer to the origin point, and more distal points refer to being closer to the insertion point. At more proximal points, shorter and longer muscle length training seem to be pretty equivalent for inducing hypertrophy, but at more distal points, it does seem pretty consistent now based on more evidence coming out and having read it a bit more closely, that longer muscle length training is just better at growing more distal sites of muscles than short muscle length training. So that's finding number one, was lengthened partials do seem to be better than for range of motion for hypertrophy at this point. Finding number two, I would say, is that distal hypertrophy specifically seems to be impacted by it. I would say at this point that beforehand, we had not quite as much evidence in a variety of muscle groups. Now we have a bit more evidence, and we have a new study in calves, for example. We have several studies in quads now. We have several studies on the hamstrings. And equally, there's been more studies comparing partial ranges of motion at different muscle lengths. So while it's not directly comparing a full range of motion to a partial range of motion, it is comparing a given range of motion at different muscle lengths to see the influence of muscle length training on hypertrophy. And it does seem to apply to a variety of muscle groups across a variety of exercises. And then the final thing is that we have some very early emerging evidence suggesting that it may be a little bit more about having a good deal of tension at long muscle lengths rather than having the absolute longest muscle lengths. So I recently peer reviewed the study that I think the guys at DDS also covered. I was involved in the peer review for that study by Zabalita, Cordy, and colleagues, and that was comparing the incline curl to the preacher curl. In the incline curl, yes, you get slightly longer muscle lengths for the biceps long head because it's a shoulder flexor and the shoulder is in a more extended position. But you don't have much tension in that position. Whereas for the preacher curl, you don't get as long of a muscle length for the biceps brachii long head, but you do get plenty of tension there. And because the preacher curl group saw a bit more growth, not much, but a little bit, it does seem potentially like getting plenty of tension at reasonably long muscle lengths is more important than getting the absolute longest muscle lengths, if that means sacrificing active tension in that position.
Yeah, that was interesting. That part of it was pretty interesting to me. But again, it sounds like you said, distal and proximal. So again, the lengthen's going to be more, again, on average distal, right? You said like it's going to have more than the short, but the shortened position is going to have a little bit of proximal. But again, it's pretty much the same there on that. But that
Correct.
Distal part's going to be the part where you're going to get a lot of benefit. I guess with that, like, I guess if somebody like was missing out on the lengthened position, how would that like look into, like, let's take the quads, for example. They're not training in the lengthened position. How would that look in terms of like muscle development at that point, if that makes sense on how I'm asking that?
Yeah. I mean, it's weird to visualize, right?
Yeah.
Because then essentially how that would look is that they would have very developed quads near the hip. So they have kind of wide hips in a way, or well-developed quads near the hip joint. But then as you get closer to the knee, they'd have less developed quads, right? So they'd have a nice sweep in a way. But then for other muscle groups, that might actually be undesirable. One interesting thing would be that if shorter muscle length training really does seem to promote a lot more hypertrophy at proximal sites than distal sites, that could theoretically down the line be used in certain very extreme cases for improving the shape of a given muscle, right? So it looks like both full range of motion and lengthened training promote pretty uniform hypertrophy across a muscle. So kind of good hypertrophy at more proximal, more sort of middle and more distal sites, right? So pretty good hypertrophy across the whole muscle. But shorter muscle length training primarily promotes hypertrophy at more proximal sites. So for example, for the quads, that would be closer to the hip. So if an individual really wanted to improve their muscle size or their shape of the muscle such that they'd have more muscle closer to the origin point or closer to the hips, at that point, shorter muscle length training may actually be an option to promote regional muscle hypertrophy and kind of maybe manipulate or improve the shape of a given muscle, potentially for physique sports. I'm kind of skeptical of how many people would actually need that or benefit from that. But I think it is an option. And if more research comes out, sort of consolidating that, yeah, shorter muscle length training primarily promotes growth at proximal points, then yeah, it could be a tool in the toolbox down the line.
Right. You also talked about pauses. And I think sometime throughout this, you mentioned that like that's something that you don't think is necessary. I may have misunderstood that you don't think that's necessarily beneficial. So pausing in like the lengthened position, thoughts on that, and like just kind of is that something that maybe, like you said, was misapplied, or maybe in the research you thought was a little bit more beneficial originally, or yeah, what does that look like there?
Yeah. So the way I view it is that at this point, we don't have any direct evidence on pausing in a lengthened position and how it influences hypertrophy. So while it stands to reason and it's intuitive that pausing in that position, so pausing requires a bit more force production than controlling the weight down, right? So let's say, for example, you're halfway down on a squat. If you all of a sudden now produced enough force to overcome gravity, you'd be going back up, right? So the eccentric part of a lift is where you produce the least force on like free weight exercises. When you're pausing, you're producing just enough force to essentially battle gravity and kind of keep the weight static, right? And when you're doing the concentric or lifting phase, you have to produce more force than gravity is sort of pushing you down with, right? So when you're pausing in a lengthened position, you're making the lift slightly harder in that stress position than it would otherwise be, which is essentially increasing how much time and how much force you produce in that lengthened position, which on average, compared to not pausing, should make it slightly more beneficial for hypertrophy. But that we don't have any direct evidence on that, right? So while it stands to reason, I think we're kind of missing the forest for the trees, right? Like it's a slight technical change. And generally, for clarity, I do recommend people pause in a lengthened position. But if I had to pick between people doing lengthened partials and pausing in lengthened position for hypertrophy, I would always pick lengthened partials because we have direct evidence suggesting that that's beneficial over full range of motion. We don't have direct evidence suggesting that actually doing a full range of motion but pausing lengthened position is better than doing a full range of motion. We just don't have that evidence. So while it stands to reason based on other findings, it's a bit more of an inference or a bit more of an extrapolation than actually just doing lengthened partials.
Okay. So I may have, so just to make sure that I understand that. So like basically it just comes down to the fact that there isn't like any direct evidence on it at this point right now. Like it's more of a theoretical. So
it's a bit more of a gamble. It's a bit more of a gamble as to whether or not it would actually improve things. Theoretically at this point, because we don't have evidence, it could make things worse. We have a rationale suggesting that it might make things better, but it's much more of a gamble compared to doing lengthened partials to emphasize the lengthened position.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So we just have a couple minutes here. So I guess two kind of final things here. Is there any other misapplication of lengthened training? And then lastly, where is this kind of headed here? Is there anything like we just talked about the pausing? Is there anything like that coming up? And I know you said you were involved with some research. So maybe just want to wrap up things with those two questions. And yeah.
So the one misapplication I can kind of think of, and I'm not like, because this hasn't been applied that much, I don't think I've come across that many misapplications yet. A couple things. One is, as I mentioned, like pausing a lengthened position or selecting certain exercises over others. I think that's fine. It probably makes sense, but I'd say it's not the most direct application. So in that sense, it is a misapplication, especially when it's done at the expense of actually directly applying the research, right? So if you're just pausing in a lengthened position, when your primary goal is hypertrophy at the expense of not doing any lengthened partials, I think that's a misapplication. The second thing that I've seen Brian Borstein do actually, and I'm not gonna like make a strong claim against this, it's just that theoretically it kind of irks me a little bit, is essentially going to failure on a full range of motion set and then letting range of motion continuously drop off until you can only do a lengthened part. The reason this irks me a little bit is not because I have beef with Brian. Brian's a great guy. but because like the research on training to failure and hypertrophy and fatigue generally is painting a pretty sad picture where training to failure is a lot more fatiguing than training a few reps shy of failure. So if you're going to failure on a set and then essentially training past failure by letting range of motion continuously drop off, that is likely going to cause substantially more fatigue. Like all the evidence we have on the time course of recovery following training to failure versus not training to failure does seem to suggest that, yeah, training to failure is pretty fatiguing compared to not training to failure. So in terms of fatigue, it's a lot more fatiguing. In terms of hypertrophy, the data we have on training to failure versus not training to failure really isn't that compelling for hypertrophy. Like you can likely train with a few reps in reserve and see the same hypertrophy as training to failure, if not even better. And so if you're trading off arguably no stimulus at the expense of a lot more fatigue, I think that's a hard trade-off, especially when the most direct application of the research, as I mentioned, would be to actually do lengthened partials, ideally with like a few reps in the tank, because that's a lot less fatiguing. So I think that's one misapplication where I think the trade-off between fatigue and stimulus just isn't worth it, combined with the fact that it's kind of a misapplication or a more of a gamble of how to apply the research than just doing lengthened partials.
Right. Yeah. So again, it just sounds like they're like the trade-off of like going all the way to failure is like, hey, you might not get as like much more hypertrophy out of it, but you're going to get a ton more fatigue out of it. And then you go past that point, it's like, okay, how much fatigue is it adding? So for you, that biggest concern there is the fatigue aspect of it. And again, there's no direct evidence of that being beneficial as well too. So like you say, just with like the pauses, it's more of a gamble right now at this point.
Exactly. It's more of a gamble, but we do have a fair amount of confidence at this point that going to failure and certainly past failure is a lot more fatiguing. Right. And we have a good amount of evidence at this point as well that training to failure likely isn't producing meaningfully more growth than training shy of failure. Right. So if we're going to failure and past failure, that's likely causing a lot more fatigue for arguably no extra stimulus almost.
Right. Cool. I guess then to follow up, last question, anything coming out here soon? I know you said you're in part of some research, anything like that, and then anywhere where you want to lead the audience to moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently in the midst of finishing up two studies. Well, starting one study and finishing up the other. One study is a calf study where people are treating one calf with full range of motion and one calf with a partial range of motion. And in that study, we're trying to equate for the muscle length being trained. So hopefully, on average, both calves are being trained through the same average muscle length, so that the only real difference between the two calves is the actual range of motion being used. So oftentimes when we're talking about range of motion and hypertrophy, one confounding variable or kind of how range of motion might influence hypertrophy is through muscle length being trained. And so once we equate for muscle length, we want to see, is there actually a difference in hypertrophy? So we're measuring hypertrophy before and after at more proximal sites, at more distal sites, measuring strength as well to see how well does a partial range of motion carry over to a full range of motion, and so forth. So that's one study, and that's coming to an end pretty soon, actually, like within the next few months. And then the second study we're running is a study in the upper body that I mentioned earlier. So we're taking trained lifters, at least 3 years of experience training in the gym, through an 8-week program, training 3 days a week, pretty effortful and productive hypertrophy training, 10 to 15 sets per week, performed to volitional failure across a variety of rep ranges, using a variety of exercises, training the whole upper body, just like you would in the gym. Measuring hypertrophy before and after in the biceps and triceps using ultrasound with more proximal and more distal points to see again whether there's a difference. And half the people will be assigned randomized to a full range of motion group where all their training is performed with full range of motion, and half the people will be randomized to a lengthened partials group where the people will be doing half the full range of motion in the lengthened position. Measuring hypertrophy before and after, both again using ultrasound in the biceps triceps and using a more global measure like a bod pod or DEXA or what have you. And also measuring 6 repetition maximum strength on a variety of exercises that are actually training during the intervention to see how well does a full range of motion training intervention carry over to a partial range of motion strength and vice versa. So those two are coming out, the calf study reasonably soon, hopefully, and the upper body study in the next couple of years, because we're collaborating with 4 other universities to get a big sample size for the study. Because ultimately, when we're talking about range of motion in trained lifters across 8 weeks, if we get 5 people per group, we're not seeing shit, you know. So in order to be able to detect differences, we need a large enough sample size to actually see whether anything is there. I'm submitting my thesis for my Ph.D. in a month, so I'm excited for that as well. And then besides that, not much that's too exciting is coming out anytime soon. I'm kind of just focused on finishing the PhD for the time being. But yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. That's my last name, Wolf and Coach with an underscore at the end. You can find my website with coaching articles, etc. at wolfcoaching.net. And you can find all of my research output at ResearchGate, Milo Wolf, my full name. There's all of my research, including meta-analysis, including future studies and stuff like that. And finally, if you like podcasts, you can also check out the Muscle and Feels podcast. It's kind of an homage to Muscle and Fitness. It's just a podcast that we run where we talk about sports science, talk some shit too, and that's about it.
I love it. Is that you and Pac on that?
It is. It is. You got it.
Cool. Yeah, man, that's crazy. That's, I think this just shows how like slow the research process is, right? It's like, oh, hey, this is actually going to be out soon. That's a couple months from now. And then the next one, the next 1 to 2 years. So just shows how long that freaking takes. But that's awesome, man. And yeah, looking forward to seeing, what kind of comes out here with this moving forward, because I feel like this is a hot topic. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of research that probably comes out here in the next couple of years over it. So cool. Well, again, Milo, appreciate your time, man. Love catching up and everything like that and hearing all the new information here. So appreciate it. And we'll chat with you soon.